The air was thick, warm, and heavy with grief as mourners gathered around the old cemetery, their breaths shallow, voices hushed to whispers. The scent of lilies clung to the air, mingling with the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. At the center, a mahogany coffin gleamed under the sun, its polished surface reflecting trembling faces. A priest's voice carried soft words of comfort, though many could barely hear through the fog of sorrow. Tears fell like quiet rain onto the grass. Then came a sound, faint at first, like a dull drum beat. The ground itself seemed to pulse beneath their feet. Heads turned in confusion. A low, rough breath cut through the silence. Something was approaching. The mourners stiffened, unease spreading before they even understood why. From beyond the cemetery gates came a rhythm, paws striking dirt with steady, thunderous weight. The air shifted, sharp with the scent of musk, primal and alien among the perfumes of mourning. One by one, faces lifted, eyes straining toward the tree line. And then, as if torn from a dream, he appeared, a lion, gaunt and scarred, mane ragged and golden, stepping into the open. A collective gasp broke through the ceremony. Panic surged like lightning across the crowd. Some shrieked, clutching one another in terror, their grief now overtaken by survival instinct. Shoes scraped against gravel as several mourners bolted for the gate, scattering like birds before a storm. Others froze, hearts hammering in their chests, bodies unwilling to move. The priest faltered, words dissolving in his throat as the creature advanced. The lion's ribs pressed against his skin with each labored breath, proof of hunger and hardship carved into his body. His amber eyes burned, but not with the wild hunger of a predator, something deeper, more intent. Still, fear wrapped around every living soul present. The animal's presence was overwhelming, impossible to process in this sacred place.
His massive paws sank into the damp soil, claws hidden but always near. Petals from a wreath scattered under his steps, crushed by the weight of his body. The wind seemed to quiet, even the birds stilled, as though nature itself paused to witness. Every second stretched unbearably, each footfall ringing louder than the last. The coffin sat only yards away, directly in his path. It seemed inevitable, an attack, chaos, bloodshed, and yet his pace remained steady, almost measured, carrying a weight that felt less like fury and more like purpose. The mourners closest to the coffin stumbled backward, their trembling hands gripping one another for strength. A child whimpered, quickly hushed by a terrified mother. No one dared to shout, no one dared to move too quickly, lest they provoke the beast. Sweat trickled down foreheads, despite the cooling shade of the trees. The priest raised his hand instinctively, as though it could ward off what was coming, his lips moving in silent prayer. Still, the lion did not rush. His breathing was labored, but his eyes never wavered from the polished wood ahead. Closer now, he passed near a young man frozen beside a gravestone. The mourner could feel the heat of the lion's body, hear the rasp of his breath, smell the raw, earthy musk clinging to his mane. The man's knees trembled, yet the beast moved on, without so much as a glance. He stepped across the path of flowers strewn in memory, his mane brushing against white petals that clung briefly before falling. His presence was not chaos now, but command, as though every person, every sound, Every breath existed only to bear witness to his next step. The distance shrank until the lion stood before the coffin itself, towering yet strangely fragile under the weight of his scars. His gaze locked on the box as though nothing else in the world existed. The hush of the crowd was absolute, so complete that the buzz of insects could be heard in the tall grass.
Eyes widened, hearts hammered, and hands shook. The animal had reached the threshold no one thought he would dare cross, and in that unbearable silence, one thought consumed every trembling mind. He would strike, he would claim, he would destroy. Then, in a movement no one could have predicted, the lion lowered his massive head. His whiskers brushed the smooth wood, his mane fell across the lilies laid atop it, and his jaw came to rest gently against the coffin. The breath that left him was not a growl, but something softer, almost trembling. Every mourner's heart stopped in disbelief. This was no attack. It was something else entirely, something the human mind struggled to grasp. The cemetery, once a place of grief, now held a moment so impossible it bordered on the divine. The lion's head rested heavy against the coffin, his mane spilling across the polished wood like a tattered crown laid in mourning. His eyes closed halfway, lids trembling as if holding back something unseen. Around him, the cemetery had fallen utterly silent. No whispers, no shuffling feet, not even the buzzing cicadas dared intrude. What moments before had been raw panic was now awe, a stunned quiet that pressed down on every chest. The beast did not move to strike, did not bare his teeth. Instead, his breath came long and uneven, brushing against the coffin like a sigh. In that fragile instant, fear melted into something far stranger, the sense that the predator had come not to destroy, but to grieve. Gasps gave way to tears, but this time they were not born of terror. The mourners stared through trembling fingers, their vision blurred with disbelief. The lion's massive paws pressed into the ground, claws sheathed, body drawn low in a posture that resembled not dominance, but submission. His chest swelled, and a sound slipped free, a low, throaty rumble that carried weight but not threat. It vibrated against the coffin, against the ground, into the marrow of those who stood frozen in place. It sounded like sorrow, like loss made flesh, and it spread a chill through every heart, a reminder that grief is not only human. The priest lowered his raised hand, lips parting in wonder rather than prayer. His voice failed him. There were no words for what stood before them. An elderly mourner whispered, "He knows," her voice cracking under the impossible truth she felt in her bones. Stories stirred in memory, stories of Jonathan Reed's quiet kindness, the way he had carried food into the woods, the way animals seemed to linger near his home. Some nodded through their tears, recalling nights when the man had slipped scraps into the darkness, unafraid of glowing eyes. Could this be one of the creatures he had once saved? Could the lion himself remember? Children peeked from behind their mother's arms, their fear tempered by a strange pull toward the sight. The beast was terrifying, yes, but his stillness carried a tenderness that unsettled and soothed at once. The wood beneath his cheek glistened where his breath dampened it. A single lily slid off the coffin's edge, landing softly against his paw, as though the flower had chosen him. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some pressing hands to their mouths, some clutching one another tighter. The tension was unbearable. How could such a moment even exist? What would he do next? The lion shifted slowly, lifting his head just enough to look upon the coffin again.
His golden eyes caught the light, glistening as though wet with some unspoken burden. Then he lowered himself further, his chest nearly touching the earth. His entire frame bowed in reverence. The ground shuddered slightly beneath his weight, yet the gesture carried no violence. It was humility, raw and unguarded, as though he had come to pay respect. The mourners could scarcely breathe, their throats locked with emotion.
Whatever bond tied this animal to the man inside the coffin, it stretched beyond reason, into a space where words failed completely. From the far end of the gathering, a man in his 40s took an uncertain step forward, his hand trembling against his chest. He remembered Jonathan speaking once of a lion cub, thin and desperate, that had wandered close to town years ago. How he had left meat near the woods, night after night, until the creature grew strong enough to disappear. His voice broke as he whispered to those nearest, "It has to be him." The words spread like fire through the crowd, turning fear into a collective gasp of recognition. If true, this was no wild intrusion, this was a return. The lion exhaled, long and low, and leaned once more against the coffin, as though nestling into the presence within. The mourners wept openly now, hands trembling as they wiped their eyes, unable to look away. What had begun in terror had transformed into something sacred, a communion between the living, the dead, and the untamed. In that moment, predator and prey ceased to exist. There was only grief, shared across boundaries no one believed could be crossed. The cemetery, once heavy with human sorrow, now carried the weight of something infinitely larger, the wilderness itself bowing its head. Then, without warning, the lion lifted his head higher, his mane brushing the lilies away. His body tensed, muscles rippling under his scarred hide, and his chest swelled. For a breathless moment, the mourners feared a sudden outburst, a break in the fragile peace. But what followed was not violence. It was the beginning of a gesture that would etch itself into memory, a sound that no heart could ever forget. And as the beast prepared to release it, every soul in that place braced themselves, knowing, somehow, that they were about to witness the impossible. The lion's chest swelled, his breath drawn deep, as though from the depths of the earth itself.
Then it came, a sound that tore through the air and shook the marrow of every bone present. It was not the roar of conquest, nor the call of dominance that echoed through savannas. It was lower, heavier, drawn out with aching weight. The cry rolled across the cemetery, reverberating off gravestones and trees, filling every heart with a grief they could not name. Mourners clutched their faces, tears streaming, their fear dissolving into awe. It was as though the lion himself lamented the man who lay within, a roar that was less a threat and more a farewell. The vibration of the sound lingered in the air long after his jaws closed. Even the leaves trembled, rustling softly in the wake of the impossible lament. The lion lowered his head once more, pressing his cheek against the coffin one final time, as though anchoring his soul to the presence it contained. His mane scattered petals, some catching on his whiskers before floating to the ground. A child whispered, "He's saying goodbye," and for once no adult hushed the voice. The words rang true, carrying across the silence like an unspoken prayer. Minutes stretched like eternity. The lion remained still, his breathing slowing, his body sagging with exhaustion. His ribs showed with every shallow rise, each inhale weighted with sorrow. The mourners, no longer terrified, stood as though rooted to the earth, unwilling to break the sanctity of the scene. Some folded their hands, not in fear but in reverence. Others closed their eyes, letting tears fall freely. In that strange stillness, predator and human stood united, bound not by fear but by grief. It was a silence no one dared disturb. Finally, the lion stirred. His muscles rippled beneath his scarred hide as he lifted himself slowly, deliberately, like a king rising from prayer. He turned his golden gaze across the gathered mourners, scanning faces that had once cowered but now glistened with tears.
For an instant, his eyes held theirs, not in challenge, but in recognition. He seemed to see them, to see their grief, to acknowledge their loss as his own. Then, with a slow, heavy step, he began to walk away. Each paw pressed softly into the earth, leaving prints that sank deep into the soil. The crowd parted instinctively, giving him passage. No one moved to stop him. No one dared breathe too loudly. He walked through the opening like a procession, his mane catching the fading light of the sun. Behind him, whispers rose again, but now they carried no fear, only reverence. He came to mourn. He remembered. The words passed from lip to lip, carried like gospel across trembling voices. No one would forget the weight of what they had seen. A predator leaving as quietly as he had come, carrying the echoes of his lament into the trees. As his form receded into the woods, his golden mane flickered one last time in the twilight. The silence left in his wake was profound, almost unbearable. The cemetery felt different now, transformed, as though it had been touched by something eternal. Jonathan Reed's funeral would no longer be remembered for grief alone. It would forever be the day the wilderness walked into a sacred space and bowed its head. The mourners, one by one, let their tears fall not in fear, but in wonder. They had witnessed the impossible. The priest finally spoke, his voice trembling but steady, breaking the silence that seemed endless. "Not all goodbyes belong to us," he whispered, lifting his gaze to the trees where the lion had vanished. The words struck like lightning in their simplicity, echoing in every heart. People nodded through their tears, clutching one another, knowing that they had shared in something beyond explanation. Their sorrow no longer felt like theirs alone. Even the wilderness had carried it, if only for a moment.
As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with strokes of orange and violet, one truth settled into the air. It had not been an attack. It had been a farewell. A moment of communion that defied the borders between man and beast, between civilization and wilderness. As if for a fleeting heartbeat, the lion had carried not his hunger, nor his might, but his grief. And when he left, it was not silence he left behind, but a legacy of compassion that would never be forgotten.